A plantation where doors remained eternally locked, a secret that crossed generations, stories of suffering that were never told. Today, you will discover the truth behind the iron gates of the closed-door plantation, a place where hope was imprisoned along with hundreds of souls. What happened inside those walls? Why couldn't anyone who entered ever leave? Stay until the end, because this story will change your perspective on one of the darkest periods in American history. And in the comments, we want to know, have you ever heard of this plantation? Leave your opinion below. The year was 1798. The Louisiana Territory was still under Spanish control, a vast expanse of fertile land bathed by the Mississippi River, where fortunes were made on the backs of enslaved human beings. It was in this context that Thomas Harrington, a wealthy merchant from Charleston, acquired 3,000 acres of prime land near New Orleans. But Harrington had plans that went far beyond simply growing cotton and sugarcane. The architecture of what would become known as the closed-door plantation was unlike anything seen in the region. While other plantation owners built their mansions to impress visitors and display their wealth, Harrington designed his estate with a different purpose: absolute control and complete secrecy. The main house rose 3 stories high, with thick brick walls, small windows protected by iron bars, and a design that prioritized isolation over elegance. But the most disturbing feature was the door system. Every entrance, every passage, every room had heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron plates. Massive locks, imported from England, secured each door. Keys hung from chains that only Thomas Harrington and his eldest son, William, were allowed to carry. Even the enslaved people who worked inside the main house had to wait for doors to be unlocked and locked behind them with each passage. The first group of enslaved people arrived in the spring of 1799. 43 men, women and children purchased at the New Orleans market. Local merchants who sold them noted something unusual. Harrington specifically requested people who had no family connections in the region, preferably those who had recently arrived from Africa or the Caribbean and spoke little English. He wanted people no one would miss, people no one would look for. The plantation's layout was deliberately designed to prevent any view from outside. Tall oak trees, their branches heavy with Spanish moss, formed a natural barrier around the property. A high brick wall, topped with iron spikes, surrounded the residential quarters where the enslaved lived. And at the main entrance, 2 massive iron gates that were only opened when Harrington himself authorized it. Within the first year, neighbors began to notice something strange. While other plantations had enslaved people who occasionally went to town on errands, or who could be seen working in the fields, visible from the road, no one from the closed-door plantation was ever seen beyond its walls. When curious neighbors asked, Thomas Harrington would smile coldly and say his operation was simply more efficient because his workers never wasted time on distractions. By 1800, the plantation had grown to hold 120 enslaved people. But unlike other properties, where records were meticulously kept for insurance and sale purposes, Harrington's ledgers contained only first names and ages, no family connections, no origins, no individual histories. It was as if these people had ceased to exist as individuals the moment they passed through those iron gates. The plantation produced cotton, indigo, and sugar, shipped down the Mississippi to New Orleans and beyond. Harrington's wealth grew exponentially, but those who dealt with him in business noted his obsession with privacy. He never invited anyone to visit the plantation. He never brought his family to social events in New Orleans. The Harrington family existed behind those locked doors, along with the people they enslaved, in a world completely cut off from the outside. Local enslaved people from neighboring plantations whispered warnings to newcomers: avoid the closed-door plantation at all costs. They called it the place where the sun forgot to shine, where voices disappeared into silence, where hope went to die. But these warnings rarely reached those who were bought and brought there, marched through those iron gates that clanged shut behind them with a finality that echoed like a death sentence. Life inside the closed-door plantation followed a rhythm of systematic cruelty that began before dawn and ended long after darkness fell. The enslaved people slept in cramped wooden structures with doors that were locked from the outside every night at 8 o'clock. At 4 in the morning, an overseer would unlock the doors and ring a bell that signaled the beginning of another day of suffering. But what made this plantation uniquely horrific was not just the brutality of the work, which was comparable to other plantations of the era. It was the complete isolation and the deliberate erasure of human connection. Thomas Harrington had implemented a system designed to break not just bodies, but spirits and identities. Families were intentionally separated. Mothers were assigned to work in the sugar refinery, while their children labored in distant cotton fields. Husbands and wives were housed in different buildings and forbidden to speak to each other during work hours. Those who violated this rule faced punishment in what the enslaved people came to call the rooms of forgetting. These rooms were located in the basement of the main house, accessible only through a locked door in the kitchen. They were small, windowless cells, barely large enough for a person to sit. When someone was sent to the rooms of forgetting, they would be locked inside in complete darkness for days, sometimes weeks, with minimal food and water passed through a slot in the door. Many emerged broken, unable to remember their own names, speaking in whispers, their eyes empty of the light that makes us human. A woman named Adeline, who had been a healer in her village in Senegal before being captured, tried to maintain her identity by secretly teaching children the songs and stories of their ancestors. She would hum melodies while working in the fields, hoping the children would remember. When William Harrington discovered this, Adeline spent 30 days in the rooms of forgetting. When she emerged, she could no longer speak. She would live another 12 years on the plantation, silent, a ghost among the living. Despite the oppression, the enslaved people of the closed-door plantation developed secret ways to communicate. They created a system of signals, the way a tool was placed against a wall, the pattern of knocks during the night, the arrangement of stones near the water well. These codes allowed them to share information, to warn each other of danger, to maintain some thread of human connection in a place designed to destroy it. Through these signals, they shared names, real names from before the plantation. They shared memories of home, of freedom, of loved ones lost. An elderly man named Kofi, who had been a teacher in his homeland, used tiny scratches on wooden boards to write messages in symbols only a few could understand. These fragments of resistance, invisible to their oppressors, were acts of profound courage. The first major escape attempt occurred in 1806. A young man named Samuel, barely 20 years old, had been at the plantation for 2 years. He had managed to steal a key from an overseer and made a copy using clay and metal scraps from the blacksmith shop. On a moonless night in October, Samuel unlocked the door to his quarters and freed 17 others. They made it as far as the main gates. But Thomas Harrington had anticipated such attempts. The gates were equipped with a bell system that rang in the main house whenever they were touched. Armed overseers were there within minutes. Samuel and 5 others were shot as they tried to climb the brick wall. The rest were captured and dragged back. What happened next became a legend of terror whispered among the enslaved for decades. Harrington gathered everyone on the plantation in front of the main house. The 12 survivors of the escape attempt were chained to posts. For 3 days, they were left there without food or water, forced to stand as an example. 3 died before Harrington finally ordered them taken down. The others were sold to the most brutal plantations in the Deep South, a fate some considered worse than death. But before Samuel died from his gunshot wounds, he managed to whisper something to a young girl named Ruth, who brought water to the wounded, the location of the key copy he had made, hidden beneath a loose stone near the well. That key would wait in darkness for decades, a small seed of hope buried in despair, until someone brave enough would find it and use it. What did you think of what you've seen so far? Does this story resonate with you? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your perspective on this dark chapter of history. Thank you so much for staying with us until this point. We know this story is difficult, but it's crucial that these truths are never forgotten. And trust us, the most revealing part is still to come. For over 150 years, the full extent of what happened inside the closed-door plantation remained hidden. The property changed hands several times after the Civil War, eventually falling into abandonment in the early 20th century. The main house, once imposing, slowly crumbled, reclaimed by the Louisiana swamps. The locked doors rusted. The secrets seemed buried forever. But in 1998, exactly 200 years after the plantation's founding, a team of historians and archaeologists from Tulane University obtained permission to excavate the site. What they discovered in the basement of the ruined main house would rewrite everything we thought we knew about this place. Behind a collapsed wall, they found a hidden room that didn't appear on any architectural plans. Inside this room were dozens of leather-bound journals, remarkably preserved in waterproof trunks. These were the private writings of Thomas Harrington and his son William, spanning from 1798 to 1862. The contents were so disturbing that the university initially restricted access to the documents, debating whether they should be made public. Thomas Harrington, it turned out, saw the closed-door plantation as more than a business venture. He viewed it as a grand experiment in what he called the science of human submission. His journals detailed methodical studies on how to break human will, how to erase identity, how to create what he termed perfect obedience through systematic isolation and psychological manipulation. He recorded everything with the cold precision of a scientist. The number of days in isolation required to make someone stop speaking their native language. The effects of separating mothers from children at different ages. The most efficient punishment methods to create compliance without reducing work capacity. Page after page of observations that treated human beings as laboratory subjects. One particularly horrifying entry from 1809 described an experiment where Harrington separated two brothers, aged 12 and 14, and placed them in different work groups. He deliberately told each boy that the other had died, then observed how this manufactured grief affected their behavior and productivity. The older brother, according to Harrington's notes, became more docile and worked harder, as if trying to honor his brother's memory. The younger brother attempted to hang himself and had to be closely monitored. But the journals revealed something even more shocking. Thomas Harrington's wife, Elizabeth, was not the ignorant Southern belle that local legends had portrayed. She was an active participant in the plantation's cruelties, and in some cases, the architect of them. Her own diary, discovered in the same trunk, revealed a woman of education and intelligence who used both to inflict suffering. Elizabeth Harrington had studied the latest European theories on education and psychology. She applied these theories in reverse, developing techniques to undo education, to destroy the psychological foundations of identity. She personally oversaw the rooms of forgetting, keeping detailed notes on which methods of sensory deprivation were most effective at different ages. In one chilling passage, she wrote about a woman named Mary who had been a teacher before enslavement. Elizabeth spent 6 months systematically destroying Mary's ability to read, using a combination of isolation, malnutrition, and forced repetition of nonsense phrases until Mary could no longer recognize written words. Elizabeth described this as one of her greatest successes. The journals also revealed the truth about the basement. The rooms of forgetting were just part of a larger underground complex. There were medical experimentation rooms where crude surgeries were performed without anesthesia, testing the limits of human endurance. There were punishment cells designed to cause maximum psychological trauma through complete darkness and silence. There was even a room where enslaved children were separated from their families and subjected to what the Harringtons called re-education, attempting to make them forget their parents and see the Harrington family as their only authority. The archaeological team found physical evidence supporting these journals: shackles embedded in basement walls, surgical tools, crude medical equipment, and most heartbreaking of all, dozens of small personal items that had been confiscated from enslaved people. Carved wooden figures, pieces of cloth with African patterns, stones and shells that must have held personal significance. Each item represented someone's attempt to hold on to their humanity, their identity, their past. Perhaps the most devastating discovery was a locked iron box found in Elizabeth Harrington's private study. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by enslaved people and addressed to family members in other locations. These letters had never been sent. They had been confiscated and kept as trophies. The Harringtons had encouraged the enslaved to write letters, promising they would be delivered, then use the contents to gain information about escape plans and resistance efforts. The hope of connection had been weaponized as a tool of control. One letter, written in barely legible English by a woman named Celia to her mother, sold to a plantation in Mississippi, read, "My heart break every day. They tell me you forget me, but I never forget you. I sing the song you teach me. I remember your face. Please remember mine. If I die here, know I die thinking of you." The letter was dated 1823. It had been sitting in that box for 175 years, a message of love that never reached its destination. By 1860, the closed-door plantation held 237 enslaved people. Thomas Harrington had died in 1841, and his son William had continued his father's practices with equal ruthlessness. But William had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated the strength of the human spirit even when systematically broken. Among the enslaved people was a woman named Harriet, though that was not her real name. She had been born on the plantation in 1835, the daughter of a woman who had been brought from Virginia. Harriet had spent her entire life behind those locked doors, never seeing the world beyond the brick walls. But her mother had taught her something invaluable before dying: the ability to remember and to plan. Harriet worked in the main house as a cook's assistant, a position that required her to move through various locked doors throughout the day. She had observed the patterns of the household for years, noting when keys were left unattended, where spare keys were kept, how the lock mechanisms worked. She had also discovered Samuel's hidden key, the one from the failed escape attempt 54 years earlier, and she kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. But Harriet knew that the failure of previous escape attempts had come from lack of planning and coordination. You couldn't just run. The Harringtons had connections throughout Louisiana. Enslaved people who escaped were hunted down by professional slave catchers with dogs. You needed a plan, resources, and most importantly, you needed everyone to move together. For 3 years, Harriet used the secret signal system that had been passed down through generations to communicate with key people throughout the plantation. An elderly man named Joseph, who worked in the stables and understood the property's layout. A blacksmith named Isaac, who could fashion tools and weapons. A woman named Sarah, who worked in the plantation hospital and had access to supplies. Slowly, carefully, a network of resistance formed. They gathered supplies over months, tools hidden in false bottoms of work bags, dried food taken a little at a time, blankets stolen one by one. They studied the guards' schedules, noting when security was lightest. They made contact with Underground Railroad conductors through trusted connections at neighboring plantations. Everything had to be perfect. One mistake would mean death for everyone involved. The plan was set for October 15th, 1862. The night had been chosen for multiple reasons. It was a new moon, providing maximum darkness. William Harrington would be in New Orleans on business. The harvest was complete, meaning the overseers would be less vigilant. And perhaps most importantly, the Civil War was raging, creating chaos and distraction throughout the South. At midnight, Harriet used the keys she had accumulated and copied to begin unlocking doors throughout the enslaved quarters. The signal was passed silently. Tonight was the night. Over 100 people quietly gathered near the main gates. But this was not just an escape. This was a reckoning. A smaller group, led by Isaac the blacksmith, entered the main house. They went to the basement, to the rooms of forgetting, to the experimentation chambers. They carried torches. Elizabeth Harrington, now in her 70s, confronted them in the hallway. Harriet stood face to face with the woman who had tortured so many, who had stolen so much humanity. What was said between them, no one recorded. But what happened next was documented in multiple sources. The enslaved people set fire to the basement, destroying the rooms of suffering that had broken so many. They took the Harrington journals and documents, evidence of the crimes committed. They opened every locked door in that house, symbolically destroying the system of control that had defined the plantation. Elizabeth Harrington fled to the second floor. The fire spread faster than anyone anticipated. The main house, built with those thick walls and heavy doors, designed to contain people, became a trap. Elizabeth died in the fire, surrounded by the locked doors she had used to imprison others. Over 100 enslaved people escaped that night. The fire was seen from miles away, a beacon that brought authorities, but by then the escapees had scattered into the swamps and forests. Some were recaptured in the following weeks, but many, perhaps 70 or 80, successfully reached freedom through the Underground Railroad network, eventually making it to Union-controlled territory, and then to northern states and Canada. Harriet was among those who made it to freedom. She would later give testimony to abolitionists about conditions on the plantation, though her accounts were so extreme that many initially didn't believe her. It wasn't until decades later, when the journals were discovered, that her testimony was validated. The closed-door plantation burned for 3 days. When authorities finally controlled the fire, the main house was a charred ruin. William Harrington returned from New Orleans to find his family empire destroyed. He attempted to rebuild, bringing in new enslaved people, but the plantation never recovered its previous profitability. When the Confederacy fell in 1865 and slavery was abolished, William sold the property and disappeared from historical records. For decades, the plantation site was abandoned. Locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of those who had suffered there. Children were warned not to play near the ruins. The iron gates rusted and fell. The brick walls crumbled. Nature reclaimed the land, as if trying to heal the wounds inflicted upon it. But the story didn't end there. In the 20th century, descendants of the enslaved people who had lived and died at the closed-door plantation began searching for their family histories. These searches became more organized in the 1980s and 90s as genealogical research became more accessible and as African American historical societies worked to recover lost histories. A woman named Dr. Claire Johnson, whose great-great-grandmother had been enslaved at the closed-door plantation, led the effort to have the site properly excavated and documented. It was her research and fundraising that made the 1998 archaeological dig possible. It was her persistence that ensured the Harrington journals were eventually made public, despite the university's initial reluctance. The excavation yielded more than just documents. Archaeologists found the remains of over 50 individuals buried in unmarked graves on the property. DNA analysis and forensic anthropology revealed evidence of malnutrition, physical trauma, and medical experimentation. Each skeleton told a story of suffering that the historical record had tried to erase, but they also found evidence of resistance and humanity. Buried beneath the floors of the enslaved quarters were secret caches, carved wooden figures depicting African deities, stones arranged in patterns that matched West African religious symbols, pieces of pottery with scratched messages. These were acts of cultural preservation, ways that people maintained their identities and their connections to their ancestral homes, despite every attempt to strip these away. One of the most moving discoveries was a small leather pouch found in one of the graves. Inside were seeds, carefully preserved, from plants native to West Africa. Someone had carried these seeds through the Middle Passage, through years of enslavement, and had been buried with them, perhaps hoping they would one day grow in free soil. Dr. Johnson had these seeds analyzed, and some were still viable. Today, descendants of those plants grow in a memorial garden at the site. In 2006, after years of advocacy, the closed-door plantation site was designated a National Historic Landmark. A museum was established to tell the story of those who lived and died there. Unlike many plantation museums that romanticize the antebellum South, this museum centers the experiences of the enslaved, using their own words from the recovered letters and documents. The names of the enslaved people, painstakingly researched from plantation records, bills of sale and oral histories, are engraved on a memorial wall. 218 names have been confirmed. Each name represents a life, a story, a person who deserved dignity and freedom but was denied both. Among those names is Harriet Jackson, which researchers believe was the full name of the woman who led the 1862 revolt. After escaping to freedom, she lived in Philadelphia, working as a domestic servant and later as a teacher in schools for formerly enslaved children. She testified before abolitionist societies and wrote a memoir in 1890, though it was not published until 1972. She died in 1903 at the age of 68, having lived more years in freedom than in bondage. The story of why this history remained hidden for so long is complex. After the Civil War, there was a deliberate effort by many white Southerners to rewrite the history of slavery, to minimize its brutalities, and to create a mythology of the noble Old South. Stories like that of the closed-door plantation contradicted this mythology too starkly. They were suppressed, dismissed as exaggerations, or simply ignored. Even in the historical community, there was long resistance to acknowledging the full extent of slavery's horrors. The Harrington Journals, when first discovered, were met with skepticism by some historians who found the documented cruelties too extreme to be credible. It took the physical archaeological evidence and the corroboration from multiple sources to finally establish the truth. Today, the closed-door plantation site serves as a place of education, remembrance, and reflection. School groups visit to learn about this history. Descendants of the enslaved come to honor their ancestors. The museum hosts programs on the legacy of slavery and its ongoing impacts on American society. Dr. Claire Johnson, now in her 70s, serves as the director of the museum. She often gives tours herself, walking visitors through the remains of the plantation, telling the stories of those who suffered there and emphasizing the resistance and resilience that persisted even in the darkest circumstances. The iron gates, restored and preserved, stand at the entrance to the site, but now they stand permanently open, a symbol that the doors that once imprisoned people can never be closed again. The truth has been unlocked. The voices that were silenced have been given back their power to speak, to accuse, to educate, and to ensure that this history is never forgotten. Now that you know the truth about the closed-door plantation, we want your opinion in the comments. How can we ensure that stories like this are never forgotten? What responsibility do we have to remember and learn from this dark history? If you were impacted by this historical revelation, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigations into places and events that changed the course of history. And don't forget to watch the next recommended video where we reveal another surprising story that remained hidden for decades. Your engagement helps keep these important stories alive. Thank you for watching and for caring about truth and justice.